We're in Galatians continually. Galatians chapter 4 down around verse 8 if you want to find that in your Bibles. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 8. I want to say thanks to Grady for teaching for me last week. I had a little bit of the sniffles late in the week, didn't think too much about it. Had a regular doctor's appointment on, was it Thursday or Friday? Whenever. And they said, do you want your flu shot? And I said, oh, I might as well. And I don't know if I had something and it just progressed and that's what it was, or the flu shot got me, or a combination of the two, but I didn't feel very good last Sunday. So I appreciate Grady and last minute taking over class and my regular preaching that I was supposed to do. I'll be preaching not this Sunday today, but next Sunday, our schedule with all the worship leaders. I was already scheduled to lead singing this Sunday, so you start moving things around, and it was just easier for me to skip a week, and I'll preach next Sunday. And so you'll have to put up with that if you have better things you want to do, places you want to visit. That'd be a good Sunday to do that. But anyway, appreciate Grady for taking that in on short notice, and that's a good thing that he is capable of taking care of that. But Galatians chapter 4, verses 8 to 11, and let's just start with the reading, and then we'll get into what we talked about, or are talking about. But then indeed, when you did not know God, you served those things which by nature are not God's. But now after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and seasons and years, and I'm afraid for you lest I have labored for you in vain. And this was the last slide we had 2 weeks ago, and the question that we said we would answer last week, or talk about last week, and that's been obviously postponed until this week. And it's at verse 10. You observe days and months and seasons and years, and I'm afraid for you lest I have labored in vain. How do we reconcile Galatians 4 verses 10 to 11 and Romans 14 verses 5 through 10? Because just reading them on the surface without thinking about context or anything else, Paul says here, you're observing days and seasons and all that, and I'm afraid for you. In Romans, however, he says, somebody observes a special day, nothing wrong with that. It's fine. Don't worry about it. And so you look at those two passages, and it's people scratch their head and say, what's he saying here? Why is he saying one thing to one thing? Is he contradicting himself? Is what's applicable for the church in Rome not applicable for the Galatian churches? And so that's what we said we would deal with in the next class, so that's what we'll talk about this morning. And, you get the modern application today of, do we celebrate Christmas or not? Do we celebrate Easter or not? Do we celebrate Halloween or not? Do we celebrate, well, you pick a holiday. There seems to be a holiday every day of the year anymore. And so do we celebrate those or don't we? We have religious friends who will not celebrate any holidays whatsoever, even birthdays. And then we have some who embrace them all, and even if they're not religious holidays, we'll put a religious twist on them and think that's okay. And so obviously we want to do what's best according to God's will, and so we'll spend a little time thinking about this. To start off, let's look at some things that are kind of surrounding that before we actually get into that particular discussion itself. And here's the first thing. That word observe. Ye observe days and months and seasons and years. Now on the surface, what do you think that term means? Observe. Celebrate. Participate. All right. Interesting thing about that word, and it's the Greek word paratereo. And I know that means nothing to you and not that much to me. But here's what the definition is. To stand beside and watch, to inspect alongside, to watch assiduously, observe carefully, keep scrupulously, to neglect nothing requisite to the religious observance of. And that's from Strong's definitions. James Strong, of course, very famous for his numbering system of all the Hebrew and Greek words. And so that comes out of his work there, Strong's definition. So when we say observe in this context, it's not just, okay, we'll celebrate this holiday, but notice the last part, to neglect nothing requisite to the religion's observance of. This word has more meaning and more intensity than just the idea of, okay, we're celebrating a holiday today, fine, and go on with the rest of our business. This is something that is much more intense than that. And so when he's talking about observe, he's talking about somewhere you are invested in this. Your heart is in it. Your practices are in it. And you don't feel right if you don't practice whatever it is or observe whatever it is that you're doing here. Here's how that same word is used in other places in the New Testament. Mark 3 and verse 2, and they watched him, Jesus, whether he would heal on the Sabbath day that they might accuse him. Notice the intensity. What were they trying to catch Jesus doing? Violating the Sabbath. Anything they could get on him to discredit what he was doing. And so the term watch there, I got a picture in my mind of this private eye sitting around the corner with binoculars and watching very carefully. They were looking for something. And so this wasn't just a people, well, were you happened to passing by the temple, what did Jesus do? No, these were people planted there with the intention of seeing what Jesus was doing. And that's the same word that we talk about here in our passage in Galatians. And the scribes and Pharisees watched him, whether he would heal on the Sabbath day, that they might find accusation against him, Luke chapter 6 and verse 7. Here's another one. And it came to pass, as he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath day, that they watched him. And their plot became known to Saul in Acts chapter 9 and verse 24. And they watched the gates day and night to kill him. And so notice the intensity of that particular word and how it's used. Translated watched in so many of these places, whereas Paul uses or at least our English translators, use that word in translated observance. So they watched him and sent spies, which who pretended to be righteous, that they might seize on his words in order to deliver him to the power and authorities of the governor. And so it's an intense word, more so than just our casual observe as we use it in our English language. And I think that's important in our understanding of what he's going to be talking about here. You observe days, months, seasons, and years. And so the question is, what does he mean by days, months, seasons, and years? And that's where the discussion comes in this particular idea. There are two schools of thought. Well, two major schools of thought, and then about 10,000 other schools of thought. Everybody's got an opinion on this. But we'll only deal with the two major ones that are more well accepted by most people in the religious worlds. The first one of those, and we call it a minority opinion, is they were pagan rituals and celebrations that the Gentiles were turning back to. And so in other words, Paul is writing to the Galatian portion, or the Gentile portion of the Galatian church. They had come along into Christ, and now we're going back to their old pagan ways and following those pagan ideas and whatnot. Again, that's a minority opinion. We'll talk just a little bit more about that in a second. Or number two, they were the Jewish feasts and celebrations that the Gentiles were adopting and practicing. And that's what we'll call the majority opinion, because most of the people that you read in context, that's where they come down on this particular topic. Not to say that just because some famous theologian says it makes it right, but I think when we get to the context, we'll understand better how that plays out. The first one that we talked about, they were pagan rituals and celebration the Gentiles were turning back to. F.F. Bruce, who is a famous religious scholar, Floyd Fivey is his name, in case you're interested in something like that, published in Paul, the Apostle of the Heart Set Free, published in 1996. This is the opinion he comes down on in Galatians chapter 4. They were the pagan rituals and celebration the Gentiles were turning back to. And several others take this position, but he's probably one of the forefront in the religious world who thought that idea. The problem with that idea, in my mind, and you feel free to disagree with me, the weakness of this argument is it doesn't fit in with the law versus promise that Paul's been talking about in Galatians. It seems like the whole problem in Galatians doesn't have to do with the pagan festivals, but the religious practices of Jews being imposed upon the Gentiles, and the Gentiles practicing those religious things in their Hebrew context. And so, again, that's why it's the minority opinion. A lot of people take what we just said there to be more relevant to this particular discussion. Here's a list of people who believe the second one, the Jewish feast: William Barclay, Adam Clark, Everett F. Harrison. And none of these people are part of our fellowship. These are people in the larger Christian world. I want you to know that they're not just I didn't just select a bunch of Church of Christ preachers that believe this. These are people in the larger religious world. James D.G. Junn, in the theology of the Apostle Paul. Matthew Henry, you're familiar with that name. He wrote a commentary on the whole Bible. So those are people who, in the larger religious world, believe that. Let's talk about some of our other people that. Denny Petrillo, head of the Bear Valley School of Biblical Studies. And this was at the Workshop in the Word in 2012 when we studied Galatians. Grady and I went. Les or Dave, was that one of the years you went when we studied Galatians? You remember? We studied so much it's hard to remember. You remember? 12. Yeah, maybe. Okay. Anyway, neither here nor there to the discussion. But here's what Denny has to say about that. It appears from this that the Galatians were actually observing the Jewish calendar, submitting to the numerous ceremonial aspects, from those involving days, that is Sabbath, Passover, Day of Atonement, of those which were longer, months, the new moon, seasons, the feasts, and the years, Jubilee. And so Denny comes down on the side of it that he's talking about the Jewish festivals that the Gentiles were adopting and practicing in the context of their religion there in Galatia. This is from David Lipscomb. You recognize that name. They kept these Jewish feasts, and his argument was once they put themselves under the law, they become debtors to do all the law enjoined. And doesn't the New Testament say something about that? If you're guilty of one point, you're guilty of what? Guilty of it all. And so it's not something you can pick and choose and say, well, I kind of like the Sabbath, and I kind of like offering turtle doves, and I kind of like this, but I don't like the rest of it, so I'm not going to do it. If you claim to follow it and don't follow it, then there's no point to it because you're guilty of everything, even those things that you happen to practice and participate in. This is from R.A. Cole. He calls it the liturgical calendar of Orthodox Judaism. They could equally refer to the quasi-magic observances that we know to have been rife in Ephesus and presumably in other parts of Asia Minor, where observances of a Christian liturgical year has become a similar bondage. And so basically he's kind of in the middle on this. He thinks that they are the liturgical calendar of Orthodox Judaism, but they could also be the paganism that we talked about earlier. And I think the point he's making there is the very part, as the church at large has made up its own liturgical calendar and set aside days that we follow. We celebrate this saint, we celebrate this event, we celebrate all of that. That's where he was headed with that argument. We've made these special holy days that we never find in the New Testament, and all of a sudden we as the church at large, and again I'm saying broad context church, are now having to follow these rituals. Bob?
Does this become a lot like those trying to follow the old Jewish law? If I go out and do all these things, I'll be saved. If I celebrate Christmas, if I celebrate Easter, I will be saved, and missing the whole point of what we're actually supposed to be doing.
Yeah, exactly. Bob makes the point, is this trying to do what I think we've called in here checkbox religion? You do all the right things, and yet the thing is we make up our own checkboxes. And we feel like if we're doing all of these things, then we're okay. And miss the whole point of the spiritual side of that, the heart involvement. Glenn?
When we say Jew, are we talking about just a Jew or a Jewish Christian?
I think either one.
Well, it seems like the Jewish Christians would be the ones that would be having more relationship with these folks than just a regular Jew.
Yeah, sure. Well, again, these are people in the church we're talking about. So they've got to be the Jewish Christians, because the Jews outside, Paul's not writing to them. He's writing to the churches of Galatia. And so that would mean if they were Jewish, they were Jewish Christians. And so those Jewish Christians, more importantly though, the Gentiles adopting those. I can see why the Jews might hang on to their traditions because they were Jews and because it was part of their culture. But for the Gentiles to adopt that, that's where Paul is really stomping hard about that. Dave and then John.
Well, all of those regulations doesn't seem to me to be addressing First Nations. Being, I'm using the ESV, instead of being, talking about former times, the ESV says being enslaved by nature to those that are not gods. That doesn't seem to have a Jewish connotation. It seems to have a pagan connotation.
Okay. All right. We're going to get to that because that's an important part of this discussion. Again, I just take it back to the comment that we made earlier. The whole context of Galatians is that Jew-Gentile issue rather than the Jew-pagan issue. And again, fitting in that context, but we've got more to talk about with that. Any other comments while we're stopped here? Mike. Oh, John was next. I'm sorry. Okay, Mike.
It seems to me like Paul isn't here saying that their observance of these days and months and seasons and years was necessarily wrong, but he was afraid of them for what it could lead to.
Okay.
What was leading up to this observance and what this kind of attitude towards them could lead to. So it wasn't like he's saying you're wrong in doing this, but he was saying, you're treading on thin ice
Okay.
by doing this. I'm afraid for what it's going to lead to, or what's in your attitude that is producing this.
Okay. All right, everybody hear Mike all right? No? Okay, Mike basically said that he was not so much seeing the actual observance as being the issue, but what led up to the observance and why you were doing it, and what was going to be the result of all of those observances in your Christian faith and your Christian life. What was your attitude of why you were doing that? Is that a good summary of what you said, basically? Okay. John, you had your hand up again.
The thought keeps coming to my mind. This is different than I was thinking about before. Whichever one it is, doesn't really matter. The fact is, you're missing the point. You're going to muddy the waters. You're going to pack all this other stuff on yourself and be all involved with trying to do that, maintain that religion, and you're going to miss what you need to do.
Okay. John makes the good point that it doesn't necessarily really matter which one it is, because you're taking stuff that's not a part of Christian faith, was not commanded part of the Christian faith, putting that on your own shoulders and trying to live according to that. And as a result of that, you've missed the point of what you are as a Christian. Dave?
Yeah. I may be jumping ahead again. Somehow this seems to be it has to tie into the rest of this chapter.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of this chapter, Paul seems to be offering a solution or a suggestion. In verse 12, he says, "Become as I am." So all that somehow must tie into what Paul is saying, that I entreat you to become as I am.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about how he had made the sacrifices that he needed to make as an apostle. So, and I don't have an answer to that, but it seems to be maybe there's something here that we don't have the full context for.
Okay. All right. Dave makes a good point, because when he gets down to verse 12, become like me. We'll talk about that when we get there, which probably won't be today with the nature of our discussion. But that's an important aspect of this. Again, context is key. What's the context of the larger body of work? Not only the chapter, paragraph, chapter, but the entire book. And so if we pull this, some people pull this verse out, you do days, months, seasons, and years, therefore you can't celebrate Christmas. Well, Christmas wasn't even a hint in the world at this point in time. So Paul did not have that in mind. But once we get to that context, I think it applies. So we'll get to that and talk about that in just a minute. A couple other comments. E. Huxtable in the Pulpit Commentary says that, again, Josephus, not a biblical writer, but we rely on him a lot for the history at that point in time. He said the words used here were also used by Josephus for the keeping of the Sabbath day. And again, not an inspired writer, but there's another clue to maybe what at least he thinks, Huxtable anyway, thinks that we're talking about in this context. George Finley. In thus decrying the Jewish ordinances, the apostle by implication allows a certain value to the rites of paganism. The Galatians were formerly in bonding to them that are not gods, and now he says that they're turning to like servitude by conforming to the Mosaic legislation. So again, this backs to Dave's comment about which is it. And Finley seems to think, well, you gave up the pagan ones, and now you're trying to adopt the Jewish ones. And he's basically saying, what's the difference? What's the difference in either one of those? Again, back to John's comment, doesn't necessarily matter if neither one of them are correct and neither one of them are things that we're supposed to be doing in our lives. And so, again, that's his particular opinion. Albert Barnes, and again, Albert Barnes is not one of us necessarily. All double the days of the Jewish festivals. It is fair interpretation to apply it to all those days which are not commanded to be kept holy in the Scriptures. We should observe as seasons of holy time what it can be proved that God has commanded us to, and no more. So what are we famous for saying? We don't add to the Word. We don't take away of the Word from the Word. Now, why do we say that? Because Scripture says it, doesn't it? It's not just our slogan. It's Scripture that says that. Don't add to the words of this prophecy. Don't take away from the words of this prophecy. And so we have to understand that our practices have to be governed by the written revelation that we have before us. Now, let's get to Romans chapter 14. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord. He who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks, and he who does not eat to the Lord does not eat and give God thanks. For none of us lives to himself, and no one dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and rose and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Now, on the surface, doesn't that sound like, I'm being a little facetious here, doesn't that sound like Paul saying, you can do whatever you want to do? Yeah. on the surface, it sounds like that.
On the surface, it seems to be keep your opinion to yourself.
Yeah, on the surface, keep your opinion to yourself. We're not going to take it that far because I don't think that's the right observance. And I think Paul is very specific in what he's meaning by that, but we'll get to that in our discussion. John?
It reminds me of the place where he says that if to you it's sinful to do a thing, and you do that thing, then to you it's a sin.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes back to conscience sake. If I, for conscience sake, can't do this, then I better not do this, whether it's approved or not. That's kind of what he's saying there. And so again, this is kind of it's a complex issue, and I don't know that we're going to have a satisfactory answer at the end, but I think we'll have a good idea of where most of us stand. Go ahead, Dave.
I think Paul is also saying that to a person who is really spiritual and in touch with the spirit of the New Testament doctrine, there is no religious harmony that brother in the first half of the week.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
But don't criticize people who disagree with you.
Yeah, don't criticize the people who disagree with you, even though you don't happen to hold that same opinion. Esteems. Remember we talked about the other word in Galatians? Observe. Well, let's talk about this word esteems. It's the word krino in the Greek language, and it means to separate, to put asunder, to pick out, to select, to choose, to approve, to esteem, to prefer, to be of an opinion, deem, think, determine, resolve. That's from Larry Pierce from the online Bible. And so that's what that word there seems to mean. It is most commonly translated judge. in our New Testaments. A few different places than that. Other instances, but concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. And in Galatians, they want to add all the holidays that go along. Well, it doesn't say that, does it? That was the end result of that Jerusalem conference in Acts chapter 15 of what was required of the Gentiles, and it wasn't to become Jews. And none of that was directed at the Jewish audience, but the Gentiles. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified, 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 2. Again, same word, just translated differently in our English Bibles. Any thoughts, comments on that? To me, the next slide is key to differentiating between Romans and what message to the church at Galatia. That phrase, one person at the beginning, one man, an individual. Galatians, he is addressing who or whom, however you use that word correctly. He's addressing the congregation and congregations to the churches of Galatia. And here he's saying one person esteems a day above another, another esteems every day. And so I'm wondering if that doesn't give us a little bit of insight into what he's talking about here. Galatians. It seems like the churches in Galatia were embracing this idea of we're going to incorporate, and again, whichever one they were, the Jewish holidays, the pagan holidays, and we're going to practice them as a church. Well, what's the end implication of that? Well, the church embraces that and makes it doctrine. Okay, and Jordan over here says, but I don't believe that's right. Then what does Jordan become? He becomes anathema to the church, doesn't he? Because he's not doing what the church has said we've got to do, even though there might be good reasons to argue that, well, the church never had the right or the ability or the authority to make that particular requirement. Whereas you take it back to Romans, and if it's just talking about individual things we do, could we say that I can do things as an individual to set aside a day maybe for prayer or for fasting or for some kind of, I'm going to read my Bible all day, or I'm going to do this all day, or it's my special day to do something to make me feel closer to God. That's one thing. It's another thing altogether for the elders of the Pikes Peak Church of Christ to can't jump up and say, okay, all of a sudden we're going to have a nativity scene in the front of our auditorium for Christmas. Do you see a difference between those two? And to me, and again, this is Kevin's personal opinion, so Lee, understand that. That's the difference between the two. And again, one person esteems one day above another. All right? I am not suggesting in any way, shape, form, or fashion that you dig up the celebrations to the goddess Diana in the first century and say, I'm going to celebrate the goddess Diana to the glory of the Lord. Yeah, I don't think that works either. So there's limits to this. It's got to be something that in and of itself is approved and legitimate and something we can do, that we have the authority to do, that I can set aside one day, but I can't expect you to set aside that day with me, nor can I compel you to do that, the same as you can't compel me the other way around. And so in a sense, that's kind of where I'm going to come down on this, and I'm going to open doors and let the fur fly. Tell me what you think. Mike.
I think my earlier comment would probably fit into our discussion here at this point a little better than it did a while ago. Again, if Paul wasn't necessarily saying that observance was wrong in itself, that would correlate with what he's saying here. Yeah, observing the days and months and years is not in and of itself wrong. What's leading up to it, your attitude in it, where it's leading to, that's dangerous. That's what I'm afraid of. But here in Romans, the Galatians and Romans, they were, the problem he's dealing with there wasn't they're going back and giving up their freedom they had in Christ. Their problem was in one-on-one relationship with each other. I'm holding you as an evil person because you celebrate this holiday, and so Paul was dealing with one-on-one relationships with each other in Romans. In Galatians, he was dealing with the church, trying to give up their freedom they had in Jesus Christ to go back to the slavery of the old system.
Sure. Yeah, I think Mike's exactly right in that context of what was going on there, and it wasn't so much. Again, if these were days, seasons, all that came from Judaism, they were God approved at one point, weren't they? Nothing wrong with them in that sense, other than the old law had been put away. And so God, he wasn't necessarily blasting the holiday itself. He's blasting, why are you keeping it? What about your mindset has made you feel like you have to do this? And how does that mesh with the freedom in Christ? How does that mesh with your spiritual walk with Jesus, not under the old law? And so, again, I think that's a good point. I saw another hand. Dave, and then John.
Maybe it doesn't apply to us, maybe it does, but Paul did say that he feared he had labored over them in vain, which implies that there was the danger of losing your soul. So
Yeah, and let's not misunderstand. This was not a lackadaisical issue that Paul was dealing with. The wording he uses in Galatians is pretty harsh. What bewitched you? I marvel. I can't. So this is not just it's kind of a side issue over here, not a big deal. It is a big deal. And we have to understand that. And we have to mesh that big deal with the very big deal Paul's talking about in Romans chapter 14, which obviously was a big deal in the churches there and how they were interacting with each other. John, you had a comment.
Yeah. The example that you were saying about if I set aside a day that's just going to be for that's called making a schedule. You know, I mean, we schedule Wednesday nights because we feel like a midweek thing is good to help us keep our batteries pumped, remind us, blah, 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 whatever. God has said that on the first day of the week you should gather together and do this. That's kind of a set in stone sort of a thing.
Yeah.
If I schedule another day, and it's a good thing, great, but if I try to hold somebody to it and say that this is Christianity and this is what you must do, even though I have nothing in the Bible to back it up, I think that's the problem.
Sure, and I think John's right. If I don't have anything in the Bible to back it up, then I don't have the right to impose that upon anybody else. Not that I have a right to impose anything on anybody else, no matter what. But again, back to the concept of the Galatian churches, if the church itself was opposing that and making it a, shall we say, test of fellowship as to whether you did that, that's where it gets to be an issue. And that's where, back to Mike's comment about what's going to be the end result of this, you're going to be driving people away from the church because of your stand that wasn't biblical to begin with. And that's a definite danger. Elwin, you had a hand up?
Yeah, further on in the chapter in the book, but basically, Paul makes a really good point about if you're in Christ and you're in the Spirit, then obey that Spirit. It doesn't matter if you're a Gentile or a Jew. It doesn't matter if you want to go back to the law, if you want to go back to the holidays. We struggle with the same thing today with things in this world that we put above the church. Our families sometimes, our jobs, the things that we like to do for recreation, we put them before the Lord. So, I mean, we all have things that we're going to continually sin and we need to be forgiven for. And he says it's all summed up in one word, and that's love. That is going to erase a multitude of sins, and that's what we have to do with each other when we do have problems, situations in our lives that are affecting us in our worship and our life with Christ. Absolutely.
That word love. Glenn?
It's inappropriate for us to observe the Passover because we have a new Passover. And that's true of all of the old law. The new covenant replaced all of those things. So we don't have it either.
Sure. We've got a new covenant. We don't live under that old covenant, so there's no need to practice that old covenant. But didn't Paul say earlier in this book to the Gentiles something about that was never intended for you? The Old Testament law was never intended for Gentiles. It was intended for the people of Israel. And so that's an important part of this discussion too. God wasn't looking out and saying, okay, you people living in Babylon have to do this, because he never gave them that law. He never made that covenant with them. It was just for the Jewish people. And again, that Old Testament, New Testament, the fact that the Old Testament law was nailed to the cross and we live under a new covenant speaks to this, that we are not bound by that old law in any way, shape, form, or fashion. And again, that seems to be the problem here in Galatia, that they're having the difficulty making that split and that separation from the Old Testament law and maybe from their pagan rituals as well. And, both of those could be accurate. So I think that's the crux of the discussion that we're having this morning. I know we haven't answered, we haven't talked about Christmas or anything like that, so we'll hold off. And if you want to say anything about that next week, we'll go on. But our very next verse is getting to what Dave pointed out. Brethren, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you and have not injured anyone at all. What does Paul mean there, and how does that fit into the context of what we're talking about with these days and festivals and feasts? And we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next week. Thank you.